Back in 2022, Sony CEO said that by 2024, phone cameras would overtake professional cameras, and I'm here to see if that's true today with the new Samsung S24 Ultra. Let's get right into it. So our first shot here of the S24 Ultra with its 1x lens looks great, lots of detail in the water, blue sky, lots of contrast, and then we move on to the A7S III with its 1x equivalent, and we see that it just looks better. The colors look a little bit better, there's a little bit more of that soft cinematic look to it, and if we look side by side, the S24 Ultra does seem to have a little bit more detail in the blue sky as well as in the boat. If we zoom in at 200%, you can see that the S24 Ultra actually has quite a bit more detail, but when we apply sharpness and contrast to the A7S III, we get the same kind of detail, which means to me that this is post-processing on Samsung's end. We have another water shot here, some nice buildings in the background, this big red boat in the middle, and we have a lot of color. That blue sky looks so good. We have a lot of dynamic range going on, and everything looks perfect. Moving to the A7S III, we see that this just looks better. There might not be as much dynamic range in the blues of the sky, but it just looks like a nicer image. It looks less sharpened, it looks just more natural and cinematic to my eye. Now side by side we can see there's a clear color difference between Sony and Samsung, and that is to be expected. Every company does their things differently, but what I see right now is that the Samsung again looks very sharp, but that's probably due to again post-processing and not necessarily lens sharpness. Just to kind of prove this point, if we zoom into 200%, you can see that the detail in the Samsung looks quite a bit better, but then again if we apply some contrast and sharpening post-production, you can see that we can get not only the same but better quality out of the A7S III compared to Samsung. So again, it's a lot of that post-processing sharpness that doesn't necessarily look good. This next shot is boring but so important because it's a dynamic range test. Usually phones have so much post-processing and computing power that they're able to bring an image and just make everything look good. But to my eye, the A7S III looks better. We have nice detail in the very difficult foliage. Now Samsung decided to kind of preserve the highlights on this one and really muddy the shadows, whereas with the A7S III, we kind of get the best of both worlds. So to my eye, the A7S III wins this battle, which is surprising to me. This next shot is just some pretty flowers I saw, and the colors actually match up perfectly in this shot, and I am quite impressed. The main difference that you're seeing here is the natural fall off and bokeh of a proper lens. This is the first shot of the S24 Ultra's ultra wide angle lens, and it looks good. There's a lot of dynamic range going on here. There's not too much distortion happening, which I really like, and it just looks very pleasing to my eye. And now we have the A7S III with its ultra wide equivalent, and it looks gorgeous as well. We have a lot of detail. The water looks really natural and flowing, and the ships in the background are sharp and in focus. Everything is looking good. Now that we have them side by side, I'm honestly leaning towards the S24 Ultra in this one because right to my eye, it looks like there's more detail, there's better color, and it's less hazy. To be fair, the A7S III is more true to life because it was quite a foggy, hazy day, so the S24 Ultra is adding additional contrast to make things look good, but this one looks really good for the S24 Ultra in broad daylight. Continuing with the ultra wide angle tests, we have the S24 Ultra on the left and the A7S III on the right, and they are looking really good. The main difference that I see is that the A7S III just looks a little bit more natural, and it has that nice motion blur because we can control the shutter speed, whereas with the Samsung, we leave it in auto mode and it looks a little bit more jittery and computery. But to anyone that's just looking on a small screen, there's not going to be a huge difference in this shot. Now we're getting into the zooms and we're testing out the 3x lens on the Ultra and the 3x equivalent on the A7S III, and it looks good. Again, I think the A7S III wins this because of its motion blur, as well as the fact that things just look a little bit more natural and cinematic in these shots right here. As you can tell, things just look a little bit too over sharpened to my eye in the Samsung, and with things coming in and out of frame, you can see that that motion blur plays quite a bit of play here because it just looks a little bit unnatural on the phone. Whereas with the A7S III, things just look a little bit more natural, and that's what we like to see. Back to the 1x lens, and this shot is looking crispy. Again, I think the motion blur is playing in favor of the A7S III, which looks really good, and I just like the colors and the highlights a little bit more in the A7S III, it seems to retain a little bit more dynamic range here, especially in the back of the buildings, which I find surprising because again, the phone should be winning in the dynamic range department. Moving back over to the ultra wide, and again, I'm kind of surprised. I feel like the A7S III looks a lot better and retains more detail in those highlights. It looks quite a bit blown out in the back here versus the A7S III. It just looks like a more natural highlight roll off. With this next ultra wide angle shot, it's hard to tell a winner. Both of these cameras just look so good in this shot. Both cameras look good in this shot, but I think I'm leaning towards the A7S III because of its color rendition. It's just a little bit more vibrant, but what I notice most is that in the reflection and in the background, the highlights are preserved, whereas they are completely blown out in the Samsung. The S24 Ultra looks to be prioritizing the highlights, whereas the Sony has a nice middle ground between the two, and in my mind just looks cleaner. Moving on to the 3x equivalent lens, and this is really hard to tell. Honestly, if you showed me these side by side and didn't label them, I wouldn't be able to tell you which was which. This looks so freaking incredible, and this 3x lens is not only good looking, but very well stabilized, especially compared to the A7S III. You can see my hand shaking. And then to take it even further, we have the 5x lens on the S24 and a 5x equivalent on the A7S III, and dang, this looks so freaking good. Again, the 5x looks really well stabilized, the image quality is great, and they look so similar. Another 5x shot battle here, and this looks so good for the Samsung. Honestly, I'm leaning towards the Samsung looking better than the A7S III in this one. It just looks so freaking good. Moving on to portrait video, and I was so disappointed with the S24 Ultra. This is just bad. There's no way around it. The blur doesn't look good, the edge detection is off, the colors and contrast is awful. Not even a close comparison to a professional video camera with a good lens on it. And this is the 2x lens, but when we move on to the 1x lens, you see the same thing. It just does not look good. There's even less blur. Don't use this mode on the S24 Ultra. What I was very pleasantly surprised about was the selfie camera portrait mode. Honestly, the S24 selfie camera portrait mode blows the rear cameras out of the water. Like, this looks very convincing to me. They did a great job. The edge detection is great. Like, I have a lot of loose hairs in the back there, and it just looks good. The exposure here could use some work, but oh my goodness, it looks comparable to the A7S III with a proper vlogging lens, and I am very, very pleased with the selfie one. They need to figure out how to do that, but on the back. Now we move on to the big kahuna mode of the S24 Ultra, the 8K. This thing looks stunning. It is so sharp. There is so much detail. It is very well taken care of. This is with the 5x lens. You can only do 8K with the 1x and the 5x, but it looks great. If we compare 8K from the S24 Ultra to the 4K of the A7S III, the 8K just looks so rich and detailed, and I love it. However, I was curious if I were to add some of that post-processing sharpening and contrast, could we get something looking almost as good as the 8K? And the answer is yes-ish. It does look a little crunchy, but you can get it looking close. This is a stunning 8K shot from the 1x lens, and it just looks so good. The exposure looks good, the detail looks good, it just looks so grandiose. Like, you can't see it on your screen right now, but in editing, oh, the amount of detail in this thing is just beautiful. And again, if we compare it to some 4K from the A7S III, there is just more detail, more information off of this one shot, and it just looks good. There's no other way to put it. Moving on to slow motion shooting, and I was actually quite disappointed with the Samsung S24 Ultra on this one. The focus tracking wasn't the best. The slow motion looks pretty good in the regular modes, and you can shoot 120 frames per second in 4K with the S24 Ultra without having to go into slow motion mode. 60 FPS is also looking good. I think the 60 FPS looks a lot better than the 120 FPS of the S24 Ultra, but the A7S III is just so freaking good. Now, both these shoot 240 frames per second in 1080, and the difference is, it's not even close. Like, yes, the A7S III takes a noticeable downgrade from the 4K, but oh my goodness, the S24 Ultra just is unusable in my mind. It is over sharpened, there is no blur, it is so processed, it just does not look good. It is a hands down win for the A7S III in all slow motion across the board, but especially in this mode. Now on to some low light night shooting. The S24 Ultra is putting in some work here and we're getting some very usable footage, but when you switch over to the A7S III, it's just not even a competition. There's so much more detail, it looks a lot more cinematic, everything is retained as it should, and it looks good. Side by side, the S24 Ultra is really trying to keep the exposure bright enough so the highlights are completely blown out and there's just no detail in the shadows. It's very mushy. And you can see this because it was actually raining, and the S24 has zero rain in it because it is so soft. Here's a pretty good low light comparison. The S24 Ultra does a good job of keeping things pretty even, but the highlights are completely blown out and not recoverable, whereas the A7S III retains a lot of that highlight detail and it just looks a little bit softer and cleaner. It's not as mushy in the shadows. The S24 Ultra looks good here in low light, but again, the highlights are just a little bit too bright and everything just looks so mushy, whereas the A7S III keeps things controlled and natural and good looking. Here's a really interesting shot because there's enough light for the phone to see what's going on, but it still blows those highlights out of proportion, whereas the A7S III keeps everything controlled and actually visible. Everything is completely blown out on the S24 Ultra, whereas it is not on the A7S III. Now, obviously, this is a very unfair comparison. The A7S III is the best low light camera in the world, so pairing it up against this worst case scenario I thought would be interesting, and it's an obvious win for the A7S III. Everything just looks so bad on the S24 Ultra, and this is on the 1X lens. Wait till we get to the ultra wide. Yeah, it is not good. Everything is just a blurry, mushy, noisy, colored, mess on the S24 where things look good on the A7S III. Just to show you this smackdown even more, just look at the water and the lights. It's just a blurry mess, whereas you can actually see ripples and water here and individual lights and buildings on the A7S III in the background. Moving on to the 3X lens, and again, it's just not a fair comparison. We have so much sharpness and detail and so much controlled lighting here. The blurry mess that is the S24 Ultra does not compare to the professional camera on this one. And just to add insult to injury, the 5X lens is not looking great in low light either, but to my surprise, performed better than I was anticipating. It's still not even close, but like, compared to the ultra wide, this is performing a lot better. You can actually make out some detail here in the shadows. I wanted to give the ultra wide another chance to shine, and it's not good in low light. Like, don't use this lens in low light. Now on to some stabilization tests, and honestly, I was shocked with how good the Samsung stabilization is. Oh my goodness. This is a smackdown win for the S24 Ultra. It's not even close. The stabilization on this thing literally looks like I have a gimbal. This looks so freaking good. Not only does it look good straight out of camera, but this is very usable and it would absolutely smack down any professional camera when you're going at these speeds. One thing I did notice is that the telephoto lenses have a little bit of this jerky robotic movement going on. This is a worst case scenario, but it looks good. I also tested out the active stabilization, and my god, this thing is just like butter. It is so freaking good, and again, it's a massive smackdown compared to the professional camera. One thing to be aware of is that this crops in and lowers the resolution from 4K to 1440p, so just be aware of that. Now, all of those tests were like a worst case scenario, and the vast majority of people are going to be using the stabilization for slow panning shots like this, and the Samsung just looks so good. I'm not even gonna compare it and waste your time compared to a professional camera because this is just so smooth. It looks so beautiful on every lens, and I was very pleasantly surprised with how good the stabilization was on the telephoto lenses, the 3X and the 5X. Sure, it looks like these things are a little bit robotic with some robotic motions at times, but it feels like it's on a rail. Like, it feels so smooth, and it's pleasantly surprising to see that. This is a test of the internal microphone of the S24 Ultra, and this is what I sound like with no work done. This is just my natural voice on the phone. And this is what I sound like straight out of the internal mic on the Sony a7S III. There is quite a bit of noise around me right now, some construction in the background, some cars going by, but this is what I sound like straight out of camera. However, this is a professional camera comparison, which means we are using some pro audio. So I've plugged in the Rode VideoMic NTG, and this is what I sound like with a microphone plugged into the camera. So after all that, I can confirm phone cameras have not in fact taken over professional cameras this year, 2024. However, I would like to point out that the S24 Ultra is an incredible camera when it comes to video. The fact that you have 4K 120 as well as 8K up to 30 frames per second on this small device is absolutely incredible. Sure, there is a long way to go in certain areas, but I do want to point out the good things that Samsung has been doing. Firstly, I love how much control you have in the Pro Camera app. You can pick your aspect ratio, you can pick your resolution, you can pick your frame rate, and depending on what you choose, it shows you what your limitations are based on your choice of settings. You also have full manual control over your shutter speed, your ISO, and your white balance, which I really like. And then of course, easy access to all your different lenses right then and there. All in all, the user interface and user experience from a professional setting is something that Sony should listen to, because this is so uncomplicated, it just makes my life easier and I know exactly what I'm doing, and it takes less time for me to set something up because the settings are just so easy to understand. One thing I noticed while shooting is that with the S24 Ultra, there's definitely some shutter lag between the time you hit record and the time you hit record again to finish the recording. There's always like a second or two before it actually starts and then stops the recording, which is a bit of a pain. It's not the end of the world by any means, but I would like to see it become a little bit snappier. The other thing I really loved is just how instantaneous the camera opens up when you double tap that side button. Something that I absolutely loved is how simple it was to move files from the S24 Ultra to my MacBook Pro. I just plugged it in via USB-C and it became a hard drive, and I dragged the files onto my desktop and I was good to go. Something Apple should take a note of. One last thing I wanted to say is that some of these videos do look a little bit over-processed, which is to be expected when you're working with such a small sensor and lens when compared to a full-frame camera, but they still look a little bit over-processed, and I would like to see more professional features like raw video or log video, something that isn't available right now stock, but you can get, I'm sure, through third-party apps. Having the ability to turn off some of that post-processing and then dial it in as I see fit in post would be really nice. Because when it comes to color grading, I like having as much control and flexibility as possible, and if you do too, be sure to check out my LUTs and presets, because that might be right up your alley. But I want to know what you guys think. Are you excited about the future of smartphone cameras? Do you think you could tell the difference between the S3 and the S24 Ultra? Do you have a preference between the two? Maybe you like the S24 Ultra better than the A7S III in some shots. Let me know in the comment section down below. My name is Mark Steiner, and I'll see you next time.